So let's talk a little bit about understanding contrast and controlling that, and then we're going to get into shooting. And I swear, all of this is going to make so much more sense once you start seeing it set up and shot. So contrast is basically the difference between the darkness, the dark side, and the light side of your image. And it's not a Star Wars thing. It's just an intensity thing or a contrast thing. Is this a low contrast or high contrast photo? Anyone? This is very low contrast. You can see how there's not a big difference between the illumination on my subject's face, the brightness of her shirt, the brightness of the background. Everything's about the same brightness. So this isn't a very contrasty or confrontational or riveting image. This is beautiful and soft and open and inviting. It's neat trying to find different descriptor words for lighting, because when you start to shoot and you're trying to interpret like your subject's or your client's vision, they might come to you with all this flowery wording, and you're like, OK, how do I turn this into practical lighting? Like, how do I interpret your words or the feeling you want into an image? Well, low contrast is one thing. Now, this is high contrast. So if you want something edgy and daring and bold and empowering, like, you might go more contrasty. And that means the difference between the exposure on her face and the rest of her in the background is very intense. So the background's like 6 stops darker, and her shirt and everything is about 3 stops darker. So this is high contrast. So working through that, kind of figuring out and envisioning what you want and the feeling you want, now you guys can start to put lighting styles to those different feelings and interpreting it that way. So low contrast, high contrast. So let's get into the practical of how we actually achieve that. All right? So tips to control contrast, fill lights. You've seen some examples of how I used a big soft fill light after I used a hard light. Reflectors are the quickest way we do this. How many of you own a reflector? A couple people? How many of you guys use it? OK, good. The reflector is amazing. You hit someone with a light, you get nice shadow detail, and use the reflector to build it up. That's the first thing we're going to talk about. And then also ambient light. So I can, in the picture of the girl out there with the blue sky, I simply used a slow shutter speed so that the ambient light from the sun was building up and was nice and soft and bright around her. If I used a fast shutter speed, the sky would have gone dark, and that would have been more contrasty. And finally, you can use special effects, like haze, or if you've ever photographed in the rain. It's so cool when light goes through the rain, fog, things like that. Special effects like that are what allow you to kind of see the atmosphere in the air between your subject and the background in your camera. And it allows you to bring out another dimension there. So let's go ahead and jump in. Our very first section is going to be talking about controlling contrast in the light. All right. So for that, we're going to start out with a hard light, because that's a great place to start for sculpting. And let's go ahead and pull the grid off of that if we could. And we'll start off with our beauty dish. This is a great hard light to start with. I'll hand that back to you. Thank you. All right. So we can kind of clear this out of the way, too, because we're going to get to shooting. And my camera setup is going to stay pretty consistent. I'm on the Nikon D850. And I love shooting this in the studio because it's super high definition files. I think they're like 47, 50 megapixels, something like that, which means the more megapixels, the more retouching I have to do. So it's a double-edged sword. And I'm on a portrait lens here because our first shot is going to be a portrait, and it's a 70 to 200. So I'm on the Tamron 70 to 200 millimeter lens. And that's good because the longer your lens, the more compression you're going to get to the face, which means it's going to render them more realistic. It's going to make people look more narrow. The cheekbones are going to look appropriate. If you use a wide-angle lens, it starts to make people swell out a little bit because of the distortion. So we're going to start with a telephoto lens. It's our Tamron 70 to 200. And we are going to be on our Nikon D850. Nothing special. I'm on manual mode here. And I'll show you what I'm going to do for my very first shot. So if I could have my subject go ahead and hop in here, please. I'll have you stand like right about here. All right. And you know what? I think I'm going to handhold this. He's tall. We got to go all the way up on this. All right, cool. How are we looking tether-wise?
We're good to go.
We're good to go? All right. Perfect. So the very first shot I'm going to take, I'm not going to have any of my lights going off. This is kind of like my, my canvas shot, or I'm trying to find my blank canvas here that I'm working with. So I manually set my camera. And if you guys look over on the screen, you'll be able to see my camera settings. I'm going to be at ISO 100. I'm going to actually drop that down to 200 now. All right. I'm at f8. I'm at 1/60th of a second. I'm going to go to 1/200th of a second. And now if you look at my first photo, we can barely see my subject, right? That's what we want. I don't want any of the light here in the room, because we have all these stage lights on so you can see me. I don't want them to affect my subject, because I'm sculpting the light. So I don't want weird colored lights coming from fluorescent or windows or anything like that. So I started here, and then I ended up going from 200 ISO to 100 ISO, which will make my photo one stop darker. And I sped up the shutter speed just a little bit to make it slightly more dark. So if I take this photograph again, we should have an image that's almost completely dark. Good. There's not much registering there. That's a good place to start. And I always start here, and I always start with my camera in manual because I want to make sure none of my ambient light is going to affect my exposure. The only light I want is coming from my camera, or from my strobes. So let's go ahead and turn that guy on, and let's bring it in to right about here, if we can. All right, perfect. And just like I said earlier, when I like to start with my main light, I like to bring it in, and this is on-camera lighting right here. All right, I like to bring it in, and I like to get the bottom of my light just about eye level so that the direction of the light's coming slightly down. And that's how we saw that little nose shadow and the cheek shadow. And then I like to bring it over just slightly off camera, just like that. Perfect. And that's going to give me some now sideways shadow. So I'm getting some depth down and depth and dimension to the side, and that shadow is going to make him look very 3D. All right, and I am not going to use a light meter for this. We're going to do the very scientific approach, and we're just going to chimp. So that's our very first shot. I like the shadow detail we're getting, so I like the placement of the light, but it's a little bright, so I'm going to go ahead and turn the flash down one full stop. And what I have here on top of my camera is a wireless transmitter. It is a transmitter, and the receiver is built into the strobe. So through a radio signal, they're able to communicate. And what's really cool is I can even set the power. So by holding down one of the down arrows here, I actually turn the power down on the strobe one stop. Let's go ahead and take that again. Excellent. I like it. So there's our first exposure. I even want to add a little more depth to this. So if I wanted to add more drama and depth to this, what would I do? Move it over a little bit. Yeah, the farther off camera this light gets, or the farther away from the angle of my lens this gets, the more detail we get. So you guys want to see a cheat? Just turn your modeling light on. Modeling light, there we go. Now I can see where that's going to come. It's going to give me a little more shadow on the left side of his face. Perfect. And for you sticklers at home, it's also moving the beauty dish out of the frame a little bit too. So I know I'm going to get some comments there. I usually do a vertical crop. Another reason I shoot the D850 is the files are so large. I can go ahead and shoot horizontally here, and then I can crop vertically and still have a very large file. So I know this is an actor's headshot. I'll be cropping this 8x10 vertical, so I know I can just take a nice large section and have plenty of file size to work with. There you go. You're seeing my mess of crops in there. Perfect, there you go, see? So that would be our 8x10 crop, just like that. Excellent. So now I look at that, and I have my three-dimensionality and my depth, okay? I want to start talking about contrast, though, because the whole portion of this class is contrast. And the contrast is that difference between the highlight and shadow, right? So if we look over here, we have nice highlight, nice shadow, but these shadows are very, very deep, all right? If I don't want that completely deep, can you mouse over that, actually? Let's see how deep those shadows are. OK, there's almost no data there whatsoever. You can see that number. So pure white or overexposed would be 255. And over here, you can see that it's almost 0, which means there's almost no color data there at all. And I don't want that. If I'm in Photoshop and I'm working on a file, I want to be able to make it more dark and contrasty or raise it up, so I never try to overexpose my highlights, and I never really want a background, or very seldom do I want a background to go completely black. So we have to add something in here to boost or lower the contrast. So can we grab one of the silver or white reflectors that we have over there? Here's the first way you do it, the easiest way. Just get a reflector, OK? You don't always need to have a second strobe to do things. There is a benefit to it, but you don't have to have that. So I'm going to have John kind of hold that straight up, just this way. Yep, and I'm going to have him, that's perfect right there. And then hold that, and I'll have you move in a little bit closer. And can you step a little bit farther back towards the background? Oh, no, you're good. I'll have Temple stay right where he is. Excellent. Beautiful. And can I get a comparison between those two, that and the first one without the reflector? Let's see if we can punch in on the face just a little bit. Woo, there we go. There's that 50 megapixel file. I'm glad you shaved this morning. We just saw every detail. Beautiful. All right, cool. So as he puts them up side by side, look at what we did. Just bringing a white reflector in slightly, we were able to lower the contrast by bringing our darks closer to our brights. Okay, so it's a more easily appealing and approachable photograph. But we kept all the definition in there. So we don't want to completely obliterate the contrast. We just want to raise the contrast or lower the contrast a little bit so it's a little bit easier to manage. And now if I look at that and I was like, man, I like the darker shadow, I can just go into curves or crank my contrast slider in Photoshop or Lightroom, and boom, I have my dark, deep shadows and all my contrast back. So in the studio and out on location, I like to control my contrast and limit that range so that if I want to later, I can make it more contrasty and crunchy and crush the blacks, or I can leave it as is and it looks nice and beautiful and voluminous and full. I don't like 2D photos. I don't want to just have a highlight and a black shadow. I like to have that whole range. I like the tonality to it. So that's the first way I would approach this. I would use a simple reflector. And can I see the reflector for a second? Thank you. The reflectors have two sides. Usually there's a white side and there's a silver. This is the white reflector. This is a great way to start because it doesn't create competing shadows. And what I mean by that is the white is simply going to bounce light back in and raise the shadow side. If I had a silver side to this, if I open this up, there's actually a silver side. The silver becomes more like direct sunlight. It's a very specular reflection. So sure, it's going to bounce light and fill the shadow, but it's going to create its own shadow too. So that's why I like to lower contrast. I like to use white reflectors or white foam core, or you can go down to the Dwayne Reed or Walgreens and buy a piece of white foam core for $2 and just hold it up, and then you've controlled contrast and raised those shadow values a little bit. So that's a great way to start right there. Thank you. The second thing I like to do is use a second light. So I'll go ahead and bring this around. This is our 5-foot octa. You guys are familiar with this. This is the cheater light, remember? Now, if I just hit him with an octa, it wouldn't have all the depth and detail that I want, okay? Because unfortunately, we can bring it around to the other side, so it's easier to see. All right. There we go. Cool. So the 5-foot octa, the softer light, remember the characteristics of that? You can't really see where the shadow begins and the highlight ends. We want that, because just like we didn't use a silver reflector because it would create competing cross shadows, we don't want to add another light over here that's going to create its own shadow again. I want one direction to my light. I want the light coming from left to right and then raising that shadow detail up. So for fill lights, I love to use soft light, because soft light is kind of like it's sneaky. Soft light just gets in there and doesn't leave much of a trace. So let's go ahead and bring that up. I'll bring this in like really close. Can I actually have you walk it in? I'm going to look through the camera and I'll have you walk it until it's just out of the frame. So keep coming, keep coming, keep coming, keep coming. Stop right there. I think we can actually go a little more. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. I guess I'm tight. All right, perfect right there. Back up just a little bit. Perfect. All right, so I'm bringing that in as close as possible, which means it's going to be as soft as possible. Now I'm going to turn off my main light, because I always like to dial my lights in one at a time. It's a lot easier to see what you're doing if you have your lights turned on one at a time. So I don't want to overfill, because if my fill light's too bright, how do you know which direction the light's supposed to be coming from? Oh, wow. Put that one in the first one with the beauty dish up together. See how one looks much softer and one looks crunchier? That's the difference between a hard and soft light right there. But that's too bright for a fill. So let's go ahead and back just to the main photo. I'm going to turn this down about 2.5 stops. And I'm going to dump the power out of that. There we go. All right, and we'll take this again. All I'm trying to do with my fill light is just barely raise it up. OK, I like that. That might be even a little too much. So let's go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5/10ths of a stop, which is a half stop. And let's take the shot again. Thank you very much for not moving. It makes it so much easier to do the comparisons. He's like, you're paying me here to just hang out? OK, fine, done. I like it. All right, so I like this as our starting point for our fill light. But do you see why I'm doing this one light at a time? I wouldn't be able to see these subtle differences if they were also competing with this big, bright, crunchy beauty dish up here. So let's turn them both on. And we should have a shot that has nice definition in the face, great cheekbone sculpting and jawline there. But now we can see detail on the shadow side, too. Beautiful. I know before we even took it. There we go. So now we have that. And now if I want to, I can turn this up a stop, take another photo. We'll lower the contrast a little bit by raising our shadow value. All right, and I can do it again, raise it another stop. We're going to lower our contrast again by raising our shadow value. That one comes in. See what we're doing here? He's still defined, but by playing with the contrast, if you can look at those last three, yeah, he's still very defined. We still see his chiseled jawline and great shadow from the nose. He doesn't look flat, but he looks very full and approachable and bright. So these are very nuanced things, but controlling contrast here, we can create a different feel for the image. And then if you go back and add the very first one with no fill as well. Like, yeah, one of those. Perfect, look at that. That's what we did. All we did here was start adding fill light in. So this is closer to a 1-to-1 ratio where he's very bright. We could have had an on-camera flash for flat lighting, but it didn't look very appealing, right? But we could see all the detail. By still using a hard and soft, we can still see all the detail in his face, but it looks much more 3D. So I wish we had a flat one that we could compare to. I'll take another one here at the end. But that's the way I like to start with this kind of setup. And how do you think I could lower the contrast range even more? Remember how we initially talked about how the woman on the rooftop had a bright shirt and a bright face and nice fill and also a bright background? If we were to add a light to the background and raise that up, then we would have a really low contrast or high key image. So let's do that. Let's flip one more light on the back. And I'm going to turn these guys both off. All right. And where are we at? 6? OK, let's get a shot there. And now we're just going to try to illuminate the background. That works for me. Doesn't need to be pure white. We'll get into that next. But notice what we have in the back, if we can take a peek at that. We've got our Ceros, so it's our monolight, and we've got our standard reflector on that. So that is our L40. It's a 40-degree spread. And the reason we have that on there is because it's pretty far away. If you didn't have a reflector on there, it would be lighting me. It'd be lighting our modifiers. It'd be lighting the back of the subject. We're trying to control here. And a big thing about controlling light is to not contaminate anything else in the photograph. So I like to focus the light on just what I want to light and not let it bounce off a ceiling or a wall. Because if you're not careful and you have an uncontrolled light, imagine what that's going to do bouncing off the ceiling. Remember what it did when we bounced the beauty dish off of the reflector? It changed the contrast and raised the shadows. Same thing if I accidentally let that bounce off the ceiling. It would fill light everything. And maybe I don't want fill light because I want some shadow detail. So we've got that on. Let me flip everything else on. Thank you, sir. And we'll take one more shot. And now we are going to further change the contrast by raising up our dark background after filling in our shadows. And this all started with one hard light to define the face. Excellent. And there's our final photo. So let's do an 8x10 crop on that. And let me get another 1.5 into this. And you can just apply that so it hits the next shot too when it comes in. So this is what I would give someone if they needed a commercial kind of acting headshot. He's worked out, he's fit, so he can kind of go ahead and play those roles. So I want to make sure that you see the detail in his jawline and face, and we chisel out all the work he's done. But I don't want to make this too contrasty and scary with too much shadow because he's still got to be able to play the relatable nice guy. All right, so I need to fill that shadow in to get a lighter, more approachable, happy feel. And I don't want it to look like I'm some amateur shooting in my bedroom or my living room, so I want to have that nice bright background so it looks, again, bright and inviting and low contrast. So that's how we would control contrast for a headshot or portrait, really easily with a reflector or with a big strobe so we've got more control. And then finally, keeping in mind the background plays a big part of the feeling of our photograph too. So we're going to do a switch now, and I'm going to show you how we can take this concept and how it creates, or we can use it to create images you see every day. So how many people buy stuff on Amazon? I buy toilet paper on Amazon because it's faster than going to the corner store to buy it, like everything.